to get a handle on what kind of qualities we wanted out of our smoke. It's pretty ugly in a lot of ways, right? But this sort of basic test proved pretty invaluable. I was just trying to find out how a smoke bolt would look if we had the flexibility to throw a lot of billboards at the problem and simulate wind and turbulence on those billboards. These experiments pretty heavily influenced the creation of a real-time curl noise that one of our engineers, Bill Rockenbeck, came up with. Rockenbeck, that's his real name, just for the record. So this is the smoke bolt in-game, and you can see how that previous reference was really utilized to help create this look. It's moving around fairly identically to the early test. I'll talk more about curl noise and the way we utilized it later. So if you break down the smoke dash effect, there's ribbons, there's soft smoke, ash and embers, and the dynamic lights. This is a closer look at the technique. I'm showing this at 1/5 speed to kind of make the effect a little bit more obvious. So it's pretty slow. This is just the transformation, disintegration, reform. But if you look at this in real time, it's really not noticeable. So it just sort of flows naturally. Here it is again, slow. So here I've added in back the ash particles that leave the hero at the disintegrate moment. They sort of move around with different curl noise, and they finally lerp back to the hero's position right at the reform moment. Give you another look at it here. I've disabled the curl noise in this demo here. This is to help kind of show how the ash particles lerp between being sort of locked in the particle mesh and then fluttering back to the hero. If you notice the particles that are spawned near the head, they actually sort of go back to the body quicker than those of the feet, and that gives it kind of this lurching and organic feel. During the dash move, the smoke whiffs fly off the hero and sort of go towards this destination to help carry the directionality of the motion. And what I'm going to show in this next clip is the relationship between the parent emitter in red and the child ribbon that follows it in yellow. Here you can see that the entire ribbon has the same facing axis from front to back, the yellow ribbon's there. This prevents the twisting that's seen in a lot of different ribbon implementations. The blue line is actually the direction of the travel of the hero, and the white is sort of that ribbon facing vector in 3D space. So this is just one example of a ribbon facing implementation. We're actually not constrained to having a single vector along the whole ribbon. We're able to set the facing to whatever we choose. So depending on what we need, we could actually have that, that vector curl through space or rotate or spin or do whatever we want, so we can create like spirals and things like that. If you're curious why those white lines are actually spinning like that, if any of you know about a cross vector, the cross product is actually between the view direction, which is the direction the camera is facing, and the blue line, which is the hero is facing. This tends to get us vector that is mostly visible. You don't tend to see the ribbons end on. They tend to always face the camera, but also face the direction he was going. This is the final smoke dash effects that you guys have seen before. You know, dashing through the air and dashing through fences and whatnot. At the time I showed this talk, I think Second Son had only been out for like 1 day, so not everybody at GDC got a chance to see this. So this is the final version of the vent travel effects. It's composed pretty much mostly out of just these three elements: smoke ribbons, sort of soft smoke, and ash and embers. Again, but combined with the dematerialize, reform events. So this is a good time to talk about a simple way we got a lot of motion out of our billowy smoke emitters. You can see how there's kind of this downward rolling and sideways rolling as the smoke billboards move upward. And one of our engineers, Matt Durasoff, he came up with a way to magnify the particle UVs such that they would scroll faster in the center than on the edges. It sort of results in a spherical shape. This is a single billboard with a scrolling UV set on it. And you can see as I adjust the magnification power that the spherical form becomes a bit more obvious. It's sort of like pinch or inflates type of Photoshop filters. And I think this is one of the simple ways we got a lot of motion out of our smoke textures without using flipbooks or flow maps or UV displacement or any of the more expensive shader techniques. I don't think we had many animated flipbooks in the game, maybe one or two. So most of the stuff that you see is done sort of with procedural shader tricks as opposed to rendering out frames from like a pre-rendered movie package. This is the final vent travel effects. You know, I love just trying to chain these around the city, see how many you can get in a row. Wispy energy and sort of the neon bits, the plasma, the gas, and adding the dynamic lights. So let's talk about more about how we did this. Particles have from that emissive sign texture. The red particles came from the red part of the sign and the blue and so forth. I've actually, I've trimmed the particle down to kind of some simple shaded billboards to kind of show you a little bit better what's going on. But you can see as they pop off, they're blue or red or white, depending on where they spawned. So this is the full version of Neon Dash. It's composed of a few different elements. There's the kind of the same sort of neon wisps. There's the body ribbons made on splines. There's neon bits, plasma gas, and there's some dynamic lights as well. So you can see we're actually spawning ribbons on off of joints in the hero to kind of create his form. And I'll talk about that, I think, in the next slide. Yep, here we go. I've isolated the ribbons that create the form of the hero's strobing dash there, as you can see as I run around. These colored lines here, they represent different spline positions that are created by feeding in a list of joints in the hero, so like elbow, wrist, etc. And there's a spline for each leg, arm, torso, neck, head. And then I actually use some rotation functions to rotate around splines, as you can see there. And that basically explains how I created that little torso spiral there. So we use a little bit of curl noise on those splines as well, to kind of modulate and move them around. But this kind of creates that torso cage, help give it some volume. So an element I talked about earlier was the sort of lingering element. And this is actually done with an intersection test against the depth buffer of the geometry. And it's not really anything new, but our engineer did something really cool in that he exposed all this to the particle system, this kind of feature. And so these billboards are screen facing, right? And you can kind of see the pattern as I move around, the pattern changes. But we can change kind of different parameters such as the size of the glow and the strength of the glow. That's kind of what I'm showing here. This feature is trying to be super useful for all the neon powers. We can alter the facing on these billboards if we want. You can see how the pattern changes kind of in a weird way when you move the camera. In this case, it was actually desirable. This is the final version of the Neon Dash. It's just a lot of fun just dashing around the monorails. That's like my favorite thing to do. I do like to call our powers time wasters though, because if you're not careful, you'll find out you've just been kind of playing the last 15 minutes and you haven't exactly been working. That's definitely a problem. And also it's distracting. I think a lot of times people would come by and they'd see something with like 50,000 particles dancing around on my screen and they would just stop and not get back to work. So it can be time wasters. So in order to make, this is an example of editing a particle system in our tool set. Here I'm editing a curve and a keyframe, and it's multiplied against this particle scale of the smoke. And if you notice that I'm still making changes even though the game clock is paused. And here I'm actually changing a constant. And again, like I said earlier, you can change a constant and enter and see these changes in real time. This is again billboard size. Now all constants can be changed to alpha brightness. It doesn't matter. Random ranges, things in brackets there, those are only evaluated at emit time, and so we don't change those because you can't evaluate or change a random number. But if you multiply another number against it, like another constant, then you can kind of change that. So I tend to use that just to make sure that I can tweak things live. This is a more complex example of using keyframes, though. Here I'm using a keyframe to adjust the rotational speed of particles on a disk. If I use the radius of the disk as the input variable, then the output is controlled by the keyframe that's multiplied in the lower right. This makes the particles move faster or slower based on the radius. So here I'm using the same sort of graph or same keyframe to drive a color lerp to kind of make the effect a little bit more obvious. You can see that the red and green kind of represent different speeds there. Remember, this is just a single emitter with only a couple expressions, right? This is, if you layer and stack this kind of behavior, that's how you get some really, really interesting stuff. You know, you do this once and then you do it like 5 or 6 more times to different elements, and that's how we created most of the really interesting stuff in Second Sun. Here the particle system is shown casting that shadow across the ground there. And I can sort of tune its shadow strength up and down. You can see it can make it a little bit more opaque. And really what we use tuning the shadow strength for is to kind of use artistic license to simulate how much the material should occlude light. So I might turn the shadows down if I'm simulating water vapor, just letting more light pass through, or I might turn the shadow strength up if I'm simulating an opaque smoke cloud, because the smoke particles are actually blocking more light. Here we can see the particle systems receiving shadows from the environment, in this case the trees there on the left. The shadows are a variable resolution depending on the distance from the camera, but the results are still pretty decent. As the sun moves around, you can kind of see that these shadows become more apparent. And all of our deferred geometry can cast shadows in a particle system. So most things can cast shadows in particle systems, with that being true. Trees, cars, characters, the paper floating through the air. Sometimes you'll see a black speck on a smoke cloud, and you'll wonder why. It's because there's a piece of paper between the smoke cloud and the sun. So here I've isolated part of the smoke missile explosion. And each of these, and we tend to adjust those when we want to blur the specular highlight. Sometimes we want to have a single light represent kind of an area or fill light versus wanting each light to be very, very distinct on a wet surface. So you can see as I move this particle system from area to area, the color from the local lighting is inherited by those smoke particles. This is just a huge level of realism that wasn't possible before. It helps them sit in the world correctly. You can see that, there must be probes like super close to this green sign because the color inheritance is really strong, right? You can see as I move it past I think that's the poem flower shop. But as I move through space, you can see the color change pretty easily. I think the probe density for Second Sun was something like 1 probe every 3 to 5 meters. We could probably increase it if we needed to, but it just takes more memory. But this is I think a sufficient level of detail we're capturing here. With Second Sun, we actually improved on what we had in inFAMOUS 2 by being able to tune the strength values of how directional sunlight affects particles. And these three emitters here, they just demonstrate a few different values of directional sunlight shading. So on the left, there's an emitter that totally has its shadows turned off. And in the middle, the strength is like 60%, and on the end, I think it's just 100%. Typically, we just use this to lower the shading values on something like a steam particle, which, like earlier when I talked about casting shadows, the sort of way light is received depends in large part on what the physical properties of the material are, right? So if it's steam, it's light's bouncing around, light's passing through, so it's not being shaded as heavily. And we tended to just raise the strength of this value on heavy, thick, opaque smoke. So many real-time curl noise demos, they use undamped accelerations when they use curl noise and acceleration. And the particles, I mean, really are gaining energy instead of slowing down. And during production of Second Sun, one of the things I really found is that you kind of have to damp the particles to slow them down and lower the acceleration speed over time to get believable results. It's kind of in context, though. Like it all depends on how you're using it. If I was making a game that was 100% magic, I might let it go like on the right there. But if you want something to be believable, you really have to damp your curl noise over time. There's a ton of uses for curl noise, though, beyond just particle velocities. And this is an example of where I'm using these noise functions on a couple of spheres. The blue sphere's got noise applied to its radius, and the yellow one has sort of a 3D positional noise that's applied to it. The shapes are really quite different, and it's the same curl noise function. I'm just putting it into a different area. And here I'm applying the noise to a ring. I think it kind of makes the differences between the two approaches look a little bit more obvious. You can see on the blue one, it's just affecting the radius, but on the yellow, it's moving all around. Another thing I can do here is adjust particle scale, right? So the potential uses are pretty limitless, right? Anything that can be parameterized in our expression system can have curl noise attached to it. So I'm actually using a little bit of, I'm using the curl noise to help drive color differences. So you can kind of see the bright as it goes out, and it's bright and it's dark towards the center. So it kind of helps see the forms a little bit better. But you can see here on the ring, that's getting pushed around in every direction. The blue one, just the radius. So it kind of depends on the input. You get a way different result. Now you can start doing silly things like this. Here I've made a particle system that's full of small fish models. And these fish swim away from the hero using only simple expressions. When I showed this demo to one of our engineers, Matt Dursoff, he calls them smarticles. You know, I think it's a really good idea of the kind of things you can accomplish with a flexible and powerful effects system. I mean, it wasn't long ago before people used AI systems to control this sort of behavior. Here I'm basically passing in the hero's position and using it as an acceleration to drive the fish away from him. So once they get in within a certain threshold of distance of the hero, that's it. Just get the vector away from that position and go away. It's fairly simple, but pretty cool.